of Mark, open up to Genesis 1. We're going to read all the way from Genesis 1 all the way to
Starting in
Mark. Yeah, exactly. Oh, there's Mike. There we go. Hey, Mike.
What's up?
Not much. Good timing, sir. We were just about to start.
Yeah, I just got back from the dishes.
Oh, have you been doing the dishes for the last few weeks? Where you been?
Busy.
That's fine. Did you know we were starting Mark today?
Yeah, I saw the post and the thing.
Oh, okay, that's cool. Oh, what's happening here? There you go.
Oh,
Don't hurt yourself.
Yeah, I did. Hello.
All right. So the Gospel of Mark. So this, well, I guess I'll ask the same question that I asked Jeremy. How many actually listened to the whole thing or a part of it?
I read maybe 8 words of Mark 1.
9 chapters is pretty good. That's over half. Yeah, good job. Okay. I will restate what I said last week, which is that if you get a chance, take some time and try and just listen the whole way through. And part of the reason why is because, you want to understand context of scripture, but I don't have a better word for what I'm trying to describe whenever I say this, other than you also want to be aware of tone. And so the way that I think of context is like, first of all, there's different kinds of context, right? So there's internal context to the text about like what's around the text and reading it. There's internal context to the specific text, and then there's context to like what it's referencing, other texts in the Bible, and then there's social context, which is like the context of like what was going around in the society at the time. But then there's something else that I kind of refer to in my head as tone, which is like the overall through line of the whole text. And you can think of it as like the aim and the goal of the text. And if you're just examining like stuff around it, you won't always be able to pick up on what that through line is. And I think it's really easy to miss that through line with the way that modern people read the Bible. The way that modern people read the Bible is do as little as possible, right? Read a verse a day, read a chapter a day, read a small section, do a devotion, like do this, which is fine if you're not reading the Bible at all. Like that's obviously better, but quite frankly, that's not the way that ancient people would have read a text. Quite frankly, the way an ancient person would have read the text is they wouldn't have read it at all. They would have gone to synagogue and someone would have read it out to them on like the Sabbath day, because that's what they did on Sabbath. You'd go to synagogue, you'd be there like all day, and someone would take like a few hours and read from like a huge section of scroll, and then maybe someone else might talk about it or something else, and then they might read from like a couple of other scrolls, and it was like it was a little bit loosey-goosey and like what they were doing, but they'd spend the whole time talking about a big section of it. And we don't really do that so much anymore. And I think that you can miss a lot and not really understand what's going on in certain portions of the Bible if you're not reading it kind of all the way through and getting a feel and a flavor for the ups and downs of the story and what's kind of happening. All right. With that, the standard plan for this is to try and do a chapter a week. But as I was going through this, I remembered that that's probably not going to be possible. One, a lot of these chapters are just straight up longer than a lot of the chapters in Genesis were. Like this first chapter is what, 45 verses, which is pretty lengthy. And on top of that, they're just really, really dense. There's a lot going on with very little. And it's very reminiscent of the early chapters of Genesis, where it was just impossible for me to kind of cram everything that I wanted to talk about in one meeting. So there probably will be a part 1 and a part 2 to definitely this week and potentially all the weeks after. I also want to let you guys know that, do you guys know who Mike Winger is? I know Evan should know him.
I've heard of him.
Okay, he's pretty prominent apologist and
Will he be showing up?
kind of like what?
Will he be showing up here?
Mike Winger? No.
This announcement's
I mean, I'd be very surprised if he did. But the reason why I'm mentioning him is because he's got a pretty prominent following on YouTube. But he also has a very in-depth series on Mark. And I watched a bunch of his videos. I've seen a lot of his videos on Mark already. I like a lot of his stuff. I'll be bringing in some of his stuff in every now and then. But then there are also things that that he talks about that I am not going to talk about. So one of the things is, along with that, talk about like tone. What I'm going to try and avoid doing as much as I can as we go through this is I'm going to try and not reference the other gospels. Now, that doesn't mean that that's like what you should do whenever you're like studying the text. But for the purposes of like this class, I want us to focus on like the gospel according to Mark as a complete and unified text that is the gospel according to Mark. I don't want us to focus on it as this is 1/4 of the gospel of Christ. And so every single time that we come up to a verse that we don't understand, we're constantly going to the other gospels and filling in the holes. I specifically, for the purpose of this class, don't want us to do that. I am not saying that that is bad, right? Like it's good to do that. But the problem is, if you're constantly doing that, you lose that tone, right? Because what you're doing is you're now bringing in the tone of all of the other gospels and you're muddying the waters with what Mark is trying to do, right? And
You said that Mark's the first written.
so yeah, so
that also kind of helps that too.
well, so there's a couple things. So one is that so what's the order that we place them in is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So in the order, it comes second. And the reason why is because traditionally people have thought that it was the second one written. It really wasn't until modern scholarship got going that most modern scholars now think that actually Mark is probably the earliest one written. Why is that the case? Part of it is because the number of sayings of Jesus, there's a lot fewer of the number of sayings of Jesus in Mark as opposed to the other gospels. That doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch in there. And also Mark is much more interested in capturing what Jesus does rather than what he's saying. And part of this goes again to that tone of what I was talking about of Jesus is kind of mysterious in the book of Mark. And it's very interesting, and we'll try and hit those points a little bit later because it shows up very early on. but one of the other things that you'll see is you'll see a lot of people try and claim that there is a development of Christology, right? And so a lot of kind of more liberal scholars say that there's a low Christology in Mark. And part of the reason why I want to do this is to point out how kind of ridiculous that idea is. If you don't know what you're reading and you just gloss over things, it's easy to agree with people that say statements like, oh, like Jesus is never called God, or like Jesus isn't divine. Jesus never says that he's God, especially in Mark, which is the earliest one that's written. But by the time that you get to John, Jesus is doing all these miracles, and Jesus is saying that he's God left and right, and blah, 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 and all this stuff. Part of the reason why I want to go over this is to show that's not right. It's not even remotely correct. So there's that. But also personally, this is probably my favorite gospel. One, there's a lot of weird stuff in Mark, and I tend to like weird stuff in the Bible. And two, personally, I love the way that Mark arranges a lot of the story. And it actually kind of reminded me because Brooke was doing so she preached like a couple of weeks ago on the line about like eat my body, right? And she was preaching out of John, and I went back and read John, and I have all these connections in my head to like stuff that is like linked to, like what that statement is linked to. And I was like reading that whole chapter, and I was like, it's not here. Where is it? Like it's missing. It's missing the fact that like right after, because the whole point is that like the statement of like you are the Christ is from Peter is immediately followed up by get behind me, Satan. And like I had that in my head that like that goes together. And I was looking at it in John, and in John they're like not connected. They're like in like different parts, and I got confused. And I was like, did I remember like the story wrong? And then I went back, and as I was reading it, and I got to that part in John, and it went in the order that like I was, or in Mark, and it went in the order. I was like, Mark's the one that did it. Mark's the one that like got it in the order that like I'm like, yeah, this is how all this stuff connects. And so I was like, okay. So now I'm like super pumped about it. I'm like, yeah, let's go.
At first you were like, oh, you did John?
I was like, did I remember stuff wrong? It's been so long since like I've read Mark. But is there anything else I want to say before we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there's that. Little bit of background. Who wrote Mark? Mark. There you go. I know. Mind blowing.
Next slide.
Got that one. There's really, I haven't heard any convincing case for, so like there's no other, like no one else is like put forward, right? You don't, right? Because we're not in like Old Testament Pentateuch thing. You don't have like this documentary hypothesis thing going on with like multiple sources from like these different time periods things. It's like, no, we got it pretty, like some people are like, ooh, maybe as late as 75 AD, as early as 60. I've seen dates as early as 50. I tend to think that there's pretty good reasons that the earlier dates are probably correct, namely dealing with persecution of Christians and more tonal stuff around the time of Nero. You also have that. So who is Mark? Mark is not one of the 12, right? a lot of people will say that Mark is really the gospel according to Peter, because Mark seems to have traveled with Peter a lot, and Peter seems to be his primary source. He's probably not his only primary source, but he seems to be like his main one. We get a lot of references to Peter and little things that Peter's done, while at the same time, very interesting to me is you kind of don't have, I don't even think it's there in John, but like this like elevation of Peter, right? Like you don't have the like on this rock, like I'll build my church stuff. It's like Peter's kind of like one of the disciples. Now he is one of the big three, right? And like does a bunch of stuff where like he's going up with Jesus and all that. But it's pretty straight whenever it comes to the position of Peter, which makes sense to me if it's like coming from him and dealing with him in that way. Mark Mark is also the one that he was going with Paul for a little bit on like his journeys, and Paul like got mad at Mark for leaving them at a certain point, and so he was like, I'm not going to travel with Mark anymore. And then Mark ended up going off with Silas. Mark is also believed to be at one point in time the bishop of Alexandria, which is in northern Egypt. But this gospel is believed to have been written in Rome, actually. But whenever we read it, it primarily doesn't seem to be in the way that I've read some of the stuff where people's theories about this are all over the place, because some people are like, oh, it was written primarily to a Roman Gentile audience, which seems really weird because if you're looking at the thing, it opens with a quote of Isaiah. So like if it's written primarily to a Gentile audience, Mark is very quickly losing them because they don't know who this Isaiah dude is. It seems to me that it's probably being written primarily to actually a Jewish audience that's outside of Palestine, which makes complete sense. There's a lot of there's the most diversity in like language in Mark compared to all of the others. There are times where there's Aramaic, there's obviously Greek, there's Hebrew references, and then there's also Latin phrases, which is part of the reason why they know that, okay, he's taking some influences from Rome, because in Rome they speak Latin. So with all that out of the way, let's get started.
Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Okay, so we're going to stop it right there already. Okay, so what is the gospel? Good news. Yes. Okay. So one of the things that you guys need to know, and this is why that point about him being in Rome is really important. The idea of good news, I've talked about this. I think I talked about this whenever we were in Genesis, right? But the idea of good news, of evangelion, right? It was primarily whenever like in a formal setting, when people were talking about good news, it was primarily a declaration of some political thing, either a victory or like the returning king. Okay. And this had been a thing that had gone around since the time of Alexander the Great. And what you would do is you would send someone out ahead of you to the next town that you were coming to, like on campaign, and you'd go, hey, the king is coming and we need to get everybody ready for it and set it up so that whenever they come in, we have like a big procession and all of that. Now, if you're coming in lands that like the king kind of already owned or was kind of returning home, this was always celebratory. But sometimes it could also be used as kind of a declaration of war. And you were sending your messengers actually to like a foreign kingdom, and you were being very hubristic whenever you say, hey, your king is coming. And they'd be like, yeah, what are you talking about? Like, right? And you can see this, you can go watch the movie 300, right? Like, this is like what happened, right? Like, bow down before me, your king is here, like, make it happen, right? And you would obviously want to do this because it made it very easy to conquer a place if you just assumed that you had already conquered it. And if everybody else goes along with it, right? It makes it it makes it very easy. And then as soon as you get someone along the way who says, no, we don't agree, you then have to make a very big example of them, right? For Alexander the Great, this was, he did this to Tyre, right? So this is the city of Tyre. You can go look this up. Tyre is like north of Israel, like, but like on the ocean. And they actually had a big base that was on an island that was about a half a mile off of like the shore. And they were like, nope, we're just going to hang out on our island. We have an awesome navy. You don't. You're primarily a land force. And so we'll just chill here until you leave because we're not going to give you jack. And Alexander was like, I'm building a bridge and I'm killing all of you. And that's what he did. And so like that idea was there. All right. It was already in like the popular like zeitgeist, if you will. Fast forward to when Jesus is around, the person that this is primarily that has this idea going on is Caesar Augustus. So if you know your history, Caesar Augustus is he takes over in like around 30 like he gets power before this, but he becomes like imperator around like 30-ish BC, right? This is like 30 years before Christ. He reigns for like a ridiculously long time. I think he actually, yeah, and he ends up dying whenever he's like 80 years old. So he's probably like 30 or something at that point. So yeah, he's probably dead I think he's dead before, like probably around the time that like Jesus is like 12 or something like that, or like around that age is probably, I'd have to like go look it up. When actually Caesar Augustus dies. But at that time, there is actually a religion surrounding Augustus. And especially by the time of Jesus doing his ministry, there is the fastest growing religion is the cult of the emperor. And that the cult of the emperor was based around the Evangelion of Augustus. And they're like, the good news of Augustus, the prince of peace has come, and he has brought order to the world. And the way that he has brought order to the world is he killed everyone that disagreed with him. And like people respected that, and it was huge. And so it was a big deal. And so the fact that Mark uses this phrase right at the beginning where he goes, I'm going to call this work the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is a direct challenge to the gospel of Augustus. And you need to understand that And you need to understand that what's going on here, there's a background to what is going on in Mark, and it is like 100% like political, and like there's a political tinge and aspect and a warfare aspect to it. And if you don't know that, you'll gloss right over it. It's just that the issue is that the people that he's fighting are not people, right? And we'll see that by the time we get to the end of the chapter. And by the way, also because of this, a lot of people think that Mark is the first person that seems to have written a cohesive story that anyone has called a gospel. And so he's kind of accredited with inventing the genre that is like a gospel.
As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight.
Okay. So the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So that Son of God portion there, if you click on it, it'll say some manuscripts omit Son of God. So there's a little bit of debate about whether or not that was there right at the beginning. Christ is the messianic title. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I will send my messenger before your face. That part, actually not from Isaiah. If you click on it, it's from Malachi. And so because of this, a lot of people are like, Mark's a big dum-dum, doesn't know what he's doing. No, the second part is from Isaiah. Who will prepare the way of the Lord? The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. What Mark's doing is a common practice where, and you would see this if, right, how do we organize the Old Testament? We have a section called the major prophets, and we have a section called the minor prophets. And it was really typical that what you would do is whenever you're just quoting the prophets, you would like combine like their statements, because there's this idea that there's like a unified voice of the prophets. And if one prophet was more prominent than the other one, you list the prominent prophet. And so you list Isaiah because that's the bigger name, right? No one cares about Malachi.
It's kind of
I
a
mean,
cool name.
people do, but
Well, that's probably why there's a similar footnote here to the Son of God footnote saying that some manuscripts just say in the prophets.
right. Now, more particular. So one of the notes to point out here is that the gospel, right, is starting, and the gospel is starting in the Old Testament, right? It starts with this kind of quote from the past. And what this is doing is this is linking the past with the present, right? It's super important for us to understand that Mark is not seeing Mark is not seeing what Jesus is doing as some random event, right? It's coming from those Old Testament prophecies and it's linking them to today. So many people want to divorce, and part of the reason why there's been a lot of controversy around Mark in scholarship for a number of years, because so many people want to divorce Mark from the fact that he's in that Jewish setting and that he's talking about the Jewish Messiah, and he's putting that up against, like I said, these Roman understandings, and you'll have a lot of people prominent people that end up saying goofy things like Mark didn't think that Jesus was God, and Mark thought that Jesus was just some kind of like important guy that got adopted by God. We'll get to that in a bit.
He calls him the Son of God.
Right. But well, and this is where those people will be like, oh, the early manuscripts don't say that. The early manuscripts don't say that. And so that was a later edition. Okay,
Do they have them?
fine. What?
Yeah, they have manuscripts.
Well, yeah, they have like some early manuscripts that don't have this stuff. And this is I forgot to mention this. This is part of the other reason why I want to go through the Gospel of Mark, is because if you don't have a solid understanding of biblical inspiration, and you have wonky views of inerrancy, some portions of Mark can be very difficult. I'll just go ahead and spoil it for you. The very end of Mark is the most controversial. Like the last, if you go to chapter 16, I believe, like the last 20 verses. If you look that up, it'll probably say basically the earliest manuscripts do not have this section, and then some early manuscripts insert completely other text here. Basically, everyone agrees that last big section on Mark was not actually written by Mark. The first time I ever heard that, it was like a big blow. And I was like, whoa. That means we got to throw out the whole Bible, right? But hopefully, as we've gone through everything that we've been talking about, in Genesis and everything, is that a later editor adding some addition in order to try and bring clarity to the story is not anything for us to freak out about. And obviously we won't be dealing this for a long time because it's at the end of Mark. But just because somebody went back in at a later point and probably added the little thing of after Christ, the Son of God, doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate passages in Mark where Mark very clearly identifies that he thinks that Jesus is the Son of God. We'll actually be hitting one of those today. Right? You don't have to go that far. Okay. Oh, what was I gonna say? No, I was gonna say something else. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Any other questions before I go on? Okay. So the other thing I wanted to say is okay, what is this passage in the prophets? What are they actually predicting, right? The voice of one crying in the wilderness, right? And we're going to see that that's John the Baptist. Prepare the way of the Lord. And the Lord is who? Yeah. Well, more specifically, it's Yahweh, right? In the Old Testament context, preparing the way of the Lord is Yahweh. And also, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. What are you doing there? When you're preparing the way of the Lord, you're making his path straight. You are acting as a herald, preparing the way into the city, into the kingdom, right? That's what you're doing. And what are you doing whenever you make their path straight? Again, this is probably actually the only point the commentary that I always rag on. This is the only point that I was like, this is a little bit stupid. He was like, this is a reference to building roads. I was like, no, it's not. You don't build a whole road just because the king is coming in. What do? You take things that are in the road and you move them out of the road, right? So rocks and things and carts and other stuff, and you make a way so that they can process through the outside into the gates. And where do they go once they're inside the city? Anyone want to take a guess?
The main square.
Yes. What is in the main square of most ancient cities?
The palace?
Some sort of obelisk.
Tabernacle?
A temple.
With an obelisk.
A temple. And with an obelisk.
I saw it everywhere in Europe. It's just oh wow, I haven't seen that before.
What you do is you process your way through, and then whenever you get to the center, you go to the temple and you make a sacrifice. That's what you do. And what you're doing is you are linking the entirety of the kingdom back up in with heaven. You're linking heaven and earth, and you're establishing order in that territory. That's what you do. And so, like, everyone does this. Alexander the Great does this as he's going from city to city, comes into a city, goes up to the Acropolis or wherever it is that he's at, makes a sacrifice to the god of that city, and goes, cool, moving on to the next one, and keeps doing that. People do it in Jerusalem all the time. There are stories about it. It freaks a number of the Greeks and the Romans out. Like when Pompey shows up, when Pompey shows up, takes over Jerusalem, goes into the temple, and he's like, I'm here to worship your God. And there's a famous story where he's like, I'm here to worship your God. And there's no image. There's no statue there. And he's like, these people are atheists. They don't have a God. And like it like messes with them, right? So that's like a famous story from that.
What do you think the temple was there for?
I don't know. I think he just thought they were weird. like a lot of people thought Jews were weird. Like, and this is why like the Romans had a hard time with the Jews. Like this is part of the reason why, like, this is why they ended up destroying the temple in 70 AD, because like
You need an image.
they're like every other place is like, oh yeah, we're gonna go along to get along. We're gonna like agree with like this with what you're saying, and you guys are in charge, but like you still respect our gods and all of that stuff and blah 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 blah. And Israel's just like, no, our God is like the one that's in charge, even though you guys are way stronger than us and can beat the crap out of us. Like, no, and will, right? And and it's a really good example of the stubbornness of the Jews is the thing that both creates a lot of problems for them, and also at the same time is the thing that ultimately ends up preserving their cultural identity.
I know a Jew who's just like
Okay. All right, let's keep going.
John appeared, baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist and ate locusts and wild honey. And he preached, saying, After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit.
Okay. So this is the portion on John. There's going to be a longer portion on John later. So John is baptizing. What is baptizing? So it's literally it's immersion, right? That's what it means. It's immersion. Baptism seems to be a practice that an array of different people had practiced prior to John. There's a group called the Essenes. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls are from. They seem to have practiced a type of baptism. But the type of baptism that they were doing is different from John's. They're doing like continuous ritual, like washings, like they do it multiple times, and you just go and do it. Whereas John seems to be kind of like a one-time event where people come out and meet him at the Jordan River, and they repent and confess their sins, and then they kind of go away. It seems to be that this act that John is doing is unique. And so it's a unique baptism to John, which is part of the reason why later on you'll have all these references to people that are like, oh, we were baptized in John's baptism. And they're saying that because they're trying to distinguish it from other types of baptisms that just random people might have done. We'll hit that point whenever we get to the next part about Jesus being baptized. So John's kind of a wild man. This is really kind of comparing him to a lot of like some Old Testament prophets, like Elijah. And there's this phrase, "After me comes he who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to stoop down and untie." So there is apparently a thing from the Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, which is a reference that say, all services which a slave does for his master, a pupil shall do for his teacher, with the exception of undoing his shoes. Why that's a thing, I don't totally know. That reference would have probably come about during during like the exile period of rabbinical teaching that was going on in Babylon, right? And part of the reason why I wanted to mention that is because one of the other key points that you need to understand as we're going through this, and really as you're going through the entire New Testament, is to understand that it is a Second Temple Judaism as the background context, right? It's not, and Second Temple Judaism is not the same as Old Testament Judaism. There are going to be things that get referenced in various works in Old Testament Jewish texts that are not in the Old Testament, but that are referenced in the New Testament. This happens a lot, and it's important for understanding why Jesus does certain things in Mark. And so I'll just go ahead and say it. Namely, whenever it comes to like casting out demons. I'll say this because mostly, I don't think I'm going to finish chapter 1. There are no references in the Old Testament that what the Messiah is going to do is that he's going to come and cast out demons. It's not there. But it shows up all the time in the Gospels, right? And the Gospels, Jesus is casting out demons like left and right. This comes from Second Temple understandings of what David and Solomon were capable of and doing. Solomon is seen as like kind of a great magician and a person that was able to cast out demons. And there are numerous accounts that people have of Solomon being able to do this. And so because of that, this idea developed that the Messiah would also be able to cast out demons. And that ultimately what the Messiah is going to do is to combat evil forces. And we'll hit that whenever we come to it more. Let's do this next part.
In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And the voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased."
Okay. So, okay. Why did Jesus get baptized? Right? Because John's baptism very specifically is about what? Repenting and forgiveness of sins, right? The purpose of John's baptism is to wash away sins. The key, so this question obviously can be easily answered if we do what I said earlier we're not going to do, which is we just jump around to other places in the New Testament, right? You jump around to other places in the New Testament and you see plenty of places where they're just like, Jesus didn't have any sin, right? And so obviously you have that something else is going on here, right? But I want to try and avoid that, because the big question that is going on in the Gospel of Mark is this question: who is Jesus? Okay. The Gospel of Mark is primarily, the way that I view it, it is primarily it's an evangelistic tool to put people in a position where they have to answer the question, who is Jesus? Okay. And like, you should understand that is the through line going on in this text. And so when the baptism of Jesus comes about, you can see from even just what happened, right? So Jesus shows up, doesn't really have much of an introduction or anything. He just shows up to John. He's baptized in the Jordan. And then as he comes up, God says, "You are my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." So what is happening here? Since God is pleased with him, it's pretty obvious that he doesn't need to go through this repenting process that everybody else is doing. So why is he doing it? Well, this can be difficult for us because we read it in our modern context and we go, oh, well, we are baptized because it's symbolic of us dying with Christ and rising up again, right? And yes, that's true. That's what it says in Romans, right? But what is Mark doing with it, right? Why is Jesus doing it? What's going on is that the way of the Lord is being prepared. And what is being prepared? People, right? It's these people that are being prepared. And so what does Jesus do? Jesus goes and prepares with them. He goes into the same depths that they're going through. But out of it comes an entirely different result, right? And so, and a declaration, right, of his status as like the anointed son, right? And so the whole being mad about it, not saying son of God earlier, it's like, well, it's God saying that you are my son right here, right? You didn't have to wait that long. Now, some people like Bart Ehrman take this passage to mean that what is happening here is that prior to this, Jesus wasn't God's son, and that he is now being adopted as God's son. Here's an argument in favor of that. The argument that I have in favor of that claim is in relationship to what I said earlier, which is that one of the primary things that Mark is doing is this is a gospel competing against who? Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus famously was adopted by Julius Caesar, who was a god, right? So Caesar Augustus was adopted by God, which is why they referred to Caesar or referred to Augustus as the son of a god or the son of God. It's later on that after Augustus has like really conquered everything and is at the height of his power, that he just gets full-blown divinity. It might even be after he dies. Might even be like posthumous or whatever. So at a certain point, so he's kind of like a nobody. He gets adopted by God, and then at a different point gets raised up to godhood. That if you think that merely what if you think that merely what Mark is doing is copying those Greek understandings, then I could see why you would think that. The issue is that Mark isn't, and Mark isn't Greek. He is putting up a competing narrative, right? But there's a big problem with saying that what's happening here is Jesus is being adopted. Namely, if Jesus is being adopted right here, it changes the through line, right? What did I say the through line was? The through line is, who is Jesus? If Jesus is being adopted right here at the beginning, it changes the through line from who is Jesus to what did Jesus do to like merit becoming adopted, right? Because that's how it worked. Like you had to do something to prove that like you were worth adopting. But Mark never answers that question, right? Mark is constantly, as you go through and read the whole thing, he's constantly playing on this thing of Jesus does a thing and then is like, don't tell people who I am. Don't reveal my identity. Like keep my identity a secret. And then at some points he gives that up and he's just like, okay, you guys know my identity. I'm accepting my fate now and everything. But it's all about this question of who is Jesus all the way through. If you change that, you lose the whole through line. And now the rest of the story kind of doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense as to why it would suddenly like be proclaimed like at one point and then be secret later. Like it gets off, right? Because if you're trying to prove, right, that you're worth your status of sonship, you need to become famous, right? That's precisely what Octavius and Augustus, or like Augustus is doing. He's going around and making himself famous, right? Like that's the whole thing. And that's actually what's proving like that he's worth his status. And constantly what Jesus is doing is he's trying to make himself less famous, actually. And he's trying to make himself less famous so that he can get more done at the right time, right? And so you have this you have this competition of how one gains status, which if you remember, whenever we were going throughout the Old Testament, that was one of the running themes throughout the Old Testament is how do you gain status, right? Do you make a name for yourself like the other Nephilim do by conquering and making like a kingdom where you like abuse everybody? Or do you do it the slow, methodical way of following God and pursuing righteousness and goodness, right? And there's that discussion that's going on throughout the Old Testament, and it's going to go on throughout the Gospel of Mark. Let's do the next section too.
The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him.
Okay. So the temptation portion. Okay, it's really short. Just those couple of verses from Mark. We don't really know what happens here, but you have that in the last thing I forgot to mention, but you have that like Trinitarian division, right? You have God in heaven, you have the Holy Spirit coming down, you have Jesus below, and then you have the Spirit driving him out into the wilderness. Drove him out. That drove him out word is the same word that's going to get used for driving out demons. So what's happening here? The Spirit is literally taking Jesus out to the wilderness. And if you don't know and don't understand, the wilderness is where demons are at, right? It's the wilderness is primarily the wilderness is the edge of civilization, right? And also it's going to be like beyond the Jordan, right? That's where it's at, like baptized at the River Jordan. Then he's taken out beyond the Jordan, right? So it's the farthest reaches of Israeli territory. And for Old Testament references to this, you have like the scapegoating things, right? So you have the one that you sacrifice, and then you have the other one that you release where? Release out into the wilderness, where he is taken by Azazel or whatever, because Azazel is like the one of the demons, right? And because so literally what Jesus is doing there, right? And he's going out and he's being tempted by Satan. In this act, it is this act is starting more or less like the declaration of war, kind of, from Jesus, right? Of going out into the enemy territory, quote unquote, and is like, stuff's gonna happen, and he's tempted, and he gets attacked, right? He gets tempted by Satan. I want to talk about this just a little bit on the temptation of Jesus. One of the things that I disagree with, I really like Mike Winger's stuff, but one of the points that I disagree with Mike Winger on is this topic that's called the peccability of Christ. So like the word impeccable, right? Impeccable is something that's flawless, but like the actual definition of impeccable is something that like can't sin, right? Flawless, can't sin. So if something is peccable, it can sin. So this isn't a common debate. Honestly, the main person that I've ever seen talk about this actually is in this series is Mike Winger. So there's a debate about when Jesus is being tempted, was it actually possible for Jesus to sin or not? Mike Winger takes the stance, and I don't know if this is true, but he says that he thinks that, but it might be true. I'm willing to agree with him that that it's true, is that most Christians say that Jesus is impeccable, meaning that he can't sin. Personally, I don't think that that makes any sense.
I thought the view that I had growing up was that Jesus was in constant, rejection of sin. That it wasn't that it was impossible. That he was living a life without sin, and he was doing it on his own.
Right.
It wasn't just like his nature. I mean, he was being perfect.
Exactly. And this is part of it. And like you can, so if you want, you can. So Mike Winger, he's got his whole like playlist. It's like episode like 5 or 6 or whatever, where he ends up talking about this and ends up talking about the peccability of it. And he gives what he thinks are some counter or some arguments that are in favor of Jesus being peccable. And personally, I think they're really weak. Like they're not at all the arguments that I would make. Like it doesn't make any sense. like he's like, oh, most of the time people argue that it's not fair because like it needs to be, the temptation needs to be fair. And I'm like, well, it's not that the temptation needs to be fair. It's just that in my opinion, it's that the temptation needs to do something, right? Because, and it's like, well, and he goes, well, the devil didn't necessarily know that it wouldn't work on Jesus. And I'm like, I don't care about whether or not the devil knows. I care about whether or not the writers think it's important, right? Because if the writers think that like it actually like made a difference, like they're the ones that included it, right? And also, it, for me, the thing that it really takes away from is verses that come later in Mark, whenever you have the discussion about whether or not, where Jesus says, like, if this cup can pass for me, like, let it be so, but not my will, yours be done. Well, fundamentally, what sin is going against God, right? And so if Jesus's will there is to do something that the Father doesn't want him to do, right? That brings about the possibility that there's a world where Jesus didn't like get crucified, right? And didn't go through those steps. And that seems to me to be something that was, had he done that, would have been against God's will, and it would have brought disunity in the Trinity. Now, of course, he's not going to do that because it's not in his nature to do that. He controls and subjects his own will to do what the Father wants. But if it was just never possible, it makes that whole internal dialogue kind of meaningless and doesn't really make any sense. And it also, for me, it doesn't make sense with how we even think about like agency, right? Because even like Calvinists, right, who are like everything's determined, what Calvinists actually say is the only being that has real agency is God, and our agency is determined by however much agency God wants to give us. I'm actually okay with that statement. Like, sure, that's fine. But you then have the problem of, if Jesus is impeccable, meaning that even theoretically he can't sin, it means that we have a level of free will that God himself doesn't have. Like, it means that, and then it doesn't even make sense, because then you're saying, how did God even give us free will if he himself doesn't have it? Like, that's very strange. It has to, at least in theory, be possible, right? And like, and so I'm doing like some weird like arguments. So like Mike Winger's argument is like, oh, people say that human beings need to be able to have sin. And he's like, well, that's not true, because in heaven we'll be human, but like we won't be sinning. And it's like, okay, it needs to be possible. It doesn't mean that you don't need to sin to be human, but you do need to have the possibility that you could do that to be human. Like, if you don't have that possibility, then like you're something else. And to me, the thing that this is like most closely like aligned to, and is that I don't think that God could give us something that at least in theory he possibly could have, right? Because if he can give us something, it clearly means that he can give it to himself, right? And so one obvious example of this to me is like a body, right? We have bodies, but God intrinsically doesn't have a body, right? He's a spirit. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible for him to have a body. Obviously, we think that's possible because of the incarnation, right? That's what happens, right? But to say that like that's how it works with sin doesn't make sense to me. And now, that being said, I do agree that in the theoretical world where Jesus does sin, I don't know what happens. Like something really weird happens, right? You have like the will of the Trinity like splitting, and you have some very strange thing that doesn't make sense happen. I agree that if that were to happen, which it never did and it never will,
It's such a
right?
weird paradox to say what if when even we knew the Father knew it wouldn't.
Yeah,
It had to exist as a possibility, like you said, for it to be right.
It
Even
does
though
sound
the
like the type of
possibility
thing
was
that Satan
completely
would
impossible.
attempt, right?
Yeah.
Like something that's so like weird and disjointed from our
right. But that being said, the idea in and of itself of there being some kind of rip in the Trinity, to me, actually isn't that wild of an idea. Why? Because I think that's actually kind of exactly what happens at the cross. Right? What happens at the cross is, and especially you'll find that in Mark, because Mark ends with the last thing that Jesus says is, Father, why have you forsaken me? And you have this idea of like, the Father puts the sins of the world on Jesus and kind of separates himself from Jesus, right? What does that mean ontologically and like in the being of God and like the nature of the tree? I don't have a clue. Like, and I can't explain it. I do know that it's not permanent, which is why Jesus rises from the dead, and like we don't really have to worry about like the eternal ramifications of like what that fully means. We'll probably never know, but that possibility of something like that seems to me like it kind of needed to be there in some kind of capacity. There had to be some kind of disjointedness between the Father and the Son to even have that happen. And so you needed to have some kind of disjointedness between the Father and the Son to have his will prior to the passion so that he could get back in line with what the Father wanted. And it seems to me that you needed to have some kind of disjointedness to be there for Satan to even like tempt him in any meaningful sense of the word tempting.
right. And that was the thing I was thinking of, is that and temptation is the key word used regarding to this incident every single time. Even in the other gospels,
Yes.
as tempting. And I feel like you can't be tempted by things that are definitionally impossible for you to do.
Yeah.
Like I can't be tempted to go fly my private jet into the moon because I can't do it for multiple reasons. From what I just said there.
I mean, your hand is just not in the condition to fly that thing.
You don't have a private jet.
Exactly. So since
No. The hand thing is much of a bigger issue.
Never mind the license either.
yeah, I don't have a pilot's license. I can't do this.
Or the moon.
Or the very planes can go to the moon. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There was a number of things that are possible by that statement. So I can never be tempted to like attempt to do that thing. And so the fact that you're referring to it as a temptation kind of implies the ability to perform the thing being done. I could be tempted to like go eat a pie or something, but I can't be tempted to do something that is physically impossible for me to do.
Yeah.
And like the language wise,
Or like I'm not even going so that far as to say that it needs to be physically possible, but even like that you could get your will to do something like that's an impossible thing, right? To fly your plane to the moon. But you can kind of will yourself to do anything. You can be like, yeah, I'm gonna will myself to fly this plane. It's like, well, you don't have a plane, and like all this other things. Like, yeah, but I can sit here and like Super Saiyan myself into being like, yeah, I'm gonna get this plane and like all this stuff. But it's like, okay, so you could be tempted to just like be an idiot for like the next however period of time that you're working on this action, right? But to say that like even that isn't possible in Christ is a really weird statement to me. Like it doesn't even make sense as to how a being, let alone a human, just a being wouldn't be able to control their will to do something. Like you have to imply that Jesus is unable to control his will to do the thing that Satan is trying to get him to do. And like the only way I can even compute of something like that in my mind would have to be like if an alien came to me and spoke to me some words that I just don't even understand. And then at the end, he's like, do you want to do that? And I'm like, no, because I can't even like compute what you're saying.
And he says yes.
I mean, maybe. So even then, my explanation doesn't work, which just goes to prove the point. Which goes to prove the point that Jesus is peccable. There we go. That's the end of that. So we'll end there. We'll pick up. So Jesus actually hasn't even spoken yet. We'll pick up at verse 14 next week. Any questions or comments about what we've covered so far?
Yeah, about the peccable thing.
Yes.
It's like I feel like the language very heavily implies that Jesus was tempted, because it's like, yeah, it's just that he was tempted, not Satan tried to tempt him.
Right, exactly. Like
Trying to tempt is being tempted. Yeah.
Yeah. So like
It's like
Jesus.
it's not like a step of temptation.
Yeah. It's like
I feel like if it was supposed to be like a one-way thing, like there was zero effect on Jesus, the verbiage there, instead of being tempted by Satan, it would maybe be more accurate to say being attacked or assaulted by Satan, because it would be something that Satan was trying to do, but there was really nothing. There was no
going
effect
on
from that.
yeah, like
harassed.
Harassed me.
Yeah, right? Like
Satan gets canceled.
like Jesus is just stoic and nothing's going on, but like Satan's around flailing about.
I think it also makes sense that like, okay, he wasn't just stoic and unaffected, hence needing to be ministered by angels.
Right. Like it like in basically in all of them, there is this idea that like the temptations kind of like, and the whole process kind of wears Jesus out. And you could just attribute that to like, oh, he's hungry. But if it was just that he was hungry, like again,
Just drop some manna down for him.
like ignore the whole part about the temptation. Just be like, he fasted for a really long time and he got super hungry. It's like, okay, cool. Like it seems to be that like the whole temptation process, like it weighed on him, and like it was a thing that he had to like battle against, and like exert effort towards. Seems to be the way that I see it.
If he was actually impeccable, you compare it to like trying to offer, I don't know, a vehicle a steak. Like, can you tempt a vehicle to eat a steak?
No, see, and that's actually probably the closest, because again, you have to you have to make a reference to something that just straight up doesn't have a will, right? A car doesn't have a will, and so you then start to have to treat Jesus as some very, very weird thing.
Autonomous thing.
Yes,
He's a robot.
it basically, and that's just weird.
My question would probably be even earlier, right, relating to the baptism story. 'Cause I'm pretty sure in the other gospels, the disciples are with Jesus. That's right.
So there are like a couple.
So I guess the larger question is like towards chronology and then sources on the story. Sources we're going through.
Right.
Because as it's given here, it's not exactly clear whether or not everyone in the surrounding area is supposed to be able to hear this voice to Jesus.
Correct.
Or if it's just Jesus.
Correct.
And then if it's just Jesus, who did Jesus tell the story to, so that we could get this written down? And then it's in this version of the story, it's not clear like, okay, when does this happen? Did Jesus do this first and then like reached out to the disciples, or?
Well, and so this is part of what I wanted to like say, like with like again the theming of like the whole thing is that there's I didn't get to it because it kind of ends with Jesus's like first statement, right? In my opinion, the reason why it's not like discussed is because what Mark is doing, in my opinion, is he's setting up this first this is like a hyper in media res thing that's going on. And so much so that, in my opinion, what Mark is doing is he's showing the end at the beginning. And that's why, like, the very first thing that Jesus says is the time is fulfilled, right? Like, which is kind of very similar to like the it is done, right? But he's like right now. And what is he referencing? He's referencing that time in the prophecy, right? Like of the Messiah coming. He's like, boom, it's right now. And it's, in my opinion, it's ordered that way because he's the baptism is like a mini picture of the incarnation. I forgot to mention this. Yeah, that's what I wanted to mention. The baptism itself is a mini picture of the incarnation. Because what is he doing? There's all these people that are trying to prepare themselves for God. And Jesus goes down and meets them, right? And he adopts their perspective, right?
You said this without saying that it was. You said it, you described this in as many words.
Yeah.
You just didn't say that it is the incarnation.
You didn't actually draw it.
But
yes.
But you described the whole parallel.
I described the whole parallel, and I wanted to reference that to the thing that we just finished talking about in you don't see the subversion of expectation so much in this as you do in the other accounts. It's like if you go read the other baptism counts, you literally have John going, no, you shouldn't get baptized. You should be baptizing me. And Jesus is like, no, this is how we're going to do it. And
the other one.
And so the whole point is that you have this, well, like referencing from Joseph, you have the subversion of expectations coupled with an adoption of their perspective, right? So you subvert the expectations while at the same time adopt their perspective. And so it makes it so that you are now in the position to lead. That's what it is, right? And so, yeah, to me, that's what Mark is doing. He's building up to that point, and he says this, and then right after that is whenever he's like going to go out. And so, yes, it is unclear in this version as to whether or not anybody else saw that, partly because you have this question that's the through line of who is Jesus? And so the question as you're going to be reading this is, who do you believe? You person that is away from home, right? Because you're probably a Jew that is out in the diaspora. Who are you going to believe, and who are you going to identify God as? I'm going to give you these clues and these hints along the way of who I think Jesus is, but who do you think Jesus is? Are you going to believe God here? No? Yes? Okay, maybe so. Well, then this is the thing that happens. Are you going to believe the demons here? No? Yes? Maybe. Here's the thing that happens. And like Mark has this like kind of constant pattern about that. And ultimately, he's going to leave it as an open-ended question where he's like, Jesus is gone. What are you doing now? So, yeah. That's why I purposefully, I think that a lot of times the reason why Mark doesn't say stuff like that is because he's throwing them in there quick to say, this is what happened. But I think he's intentionally not giving details because he's trying to move along in this question. So yeah, that's my theory. I don't think it's just that because it's the earliest one, it didn't say that much, and the story needed to get developed up later. It's like, okay, first of all, part of the reason why you think it's the earliest one is because it doesn't say as much. But historically, they all thought that it came second. So there's actually a chance that it might not even be the earliest one. So there's that. So I think I'll end it there. Did you have a question, Mike?
No, all good here.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Sorry we went a little bit long. And come back next week.